On the first day of VBS, they announced that if they reached their fundraising goal, I was going to get dunked in a dunk tank. And Elizabeth started crying. She was really upset about that. But I tell you what, by the end day, she was out there in the front screaming, "Dunk him, dunk him." So I don't know what happened to my child over VBS, but she enjoyed it. And kind of a powerful one, getting to share the gospel message to your own kids during that time as well. Now, last week we kicked off a new sermon series looking at the book of Numbers, the Old Testament book of Numbers. And the name of the book of Numbers kind of comes from the Greek lineage of the text, but man, I almost like the Hebrew name for this book better. The Hebrew name for this book is In the Desert. And that's because this is the book that spans that time from Mount Sinai all the way to the edge of the Promised Land, those 40 years wandering in the wilderness. And we hear all the stories of what happened during that time. There's some pretty incredible things. Now, this morning, we are going to cover 11 chapters of the book of Numbers. Pretty impressive. There's a lot of chapters. But don't panic, because there's a reason why we can cover 11 chapters this morning, and it's because these 11 chapters all follow a pattern. There's a pattern. There's a structure that happens over and over and over through these chapters. And something eerie will happen as we start to learn this structure, this pattern that happens a half dozen times or more. And that eerie thing that happens is as we start to learn the pattern of these 11 chapters, we start to see that this pattern is actually a pattern that shows up in our life sometimes. It's a pattern in these chapters that happens in the lives of people around us. So what is this pattern structure that happens over the course of 11 chapters over and over and over in the book of Numbers? And this pattern involves basically three key things, three key elements to this pattern. The first is rebellion. Over and over and over. The pattern begins with rebellion, and then it goes to justice, and then it ends in redemption. So rebellion, justice, redemption. This pattern keeps flowing over and over. And we'll break down the first two of those elements in detail this morning, the rebellion and justice, and we'll kind of touch on that third one. Next week, we'll spend a lot more time diving into what is this redemption. What does it look like? What does it mean in the book of Numbers? But I wanted to start by just giving you a quick sample. What is this pattern? And so the book of Numbers, it kicks off in chapter 11 with a very short, brief sample of what this pattern looks like. It's in fact the first two verses. They foreshadow what's going to happen in the rest of the 11 chapters that follow. So we see in Numbers chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord. And when he heard them, his anger was aroused. Then fire from the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. When the people cried out to Moses, he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down." Now, at the start of chapter 11, right, the people in this context are only 3 days into their journey. They've made it 3 days out into the wilderness as they're headed to the promised land. And already they're complaining and grumbling. And it's sort of foreboding, right? It's ominous for what's going to come in the rest of the chapters. And we see these three core elements play out in even this short 2-verse sample. That first element, rebellion. Oftentimes, the rebellion, it starts with these key words you'll see over and over and over, and it's the words complain or grumbled or rose up. And they're used to describe the onset of a rebellious act, right? Rebellion. And in this sample, everyone is cranky about having been on the road for 3 days, right? So they're complaining. And that leads us to the second act that happens, justice. There's some sort of consequence, some sort of reaction that happens as a result of the rebellion. And in this case, there's fire on the outskirts of the camp, which isn't totally traumatizing, right? But it's still alarming. The third act, of this pattern is redemption. In this example, we see Moses give this intercessory prayer on behalf of the people, and the fire dies out. Now, this was just a sample. This was just 2 verses that shows us this pattern. And what's going to happen is because this pattern is going to keep growing and get bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more and more intense. Every time we see this pattern happen, it gets bigger. Rebellion, justice, redemption. So get yourselves ready, okay? We're going to look at that first core element and see what happens on each of these little iterations of this pattern that happened through these 11 chapters. So when it comes to rebellion, the rebellion basically goes from bad to worse. It gets exponentially worse. Things start to get worse and worse and worse every time this pattern of this structure happens. So in the first instance, in chapter 11, verse 4, we hear about this word, the rabble. A group of people, the rabble, right? And this is a mixed group of largely like non-Israelite people who've been following the Israelites out of Egypt. They've been traveling with them to the promised land. And God has been miraculously sustaining the people with this bread from heaven every morning called manna. But the rabble, they begin complaining. They begin grumbling about how good it was when they were slaves in Egypt, right? The food was so much better. They begin craving meat. And this is, they get tired of basically eating bread. They want to go on the carnivore diet. We want meat. And everyone begins wailing and complaining at Moses' tent. So this is the start of this pattern, the first instance. Then we hear another instance, and it gets a little worse. It goes from the rabble to the family. It's Moses' brother and sister, Miriam and Aaron, and it becomes a family affair. In fact, Miriam and Aaron begin complaining about Moses' wife, how she's an outsider, an ethnic, not ethnically an Israelite. And they begin complaining even more. It gets growing, this family little dispute about how basically, Moses gets all the attention. After all, did you know that Miriam is a prophetess? Exodus 15. She's like a prophet as well. But Moses gets the spotlight. Like, I'm a prophet. Like, why does he get all the attention? And they start complaining, and this little internal family affair begins happening. Then it grows even bigger. Now it's not just the rabble or the family. Now it's the whole Israelite nation. And the Israelites, it escalates even bigger because they're all standing in chapter 4 at the edge of the promised land. They're like standing across the seashore. They can see it over there. And all of a sudden, they're there at the border. But, Numbers 14, verse 1. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. Like, why are they weeping? All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. So things are starting to get really bad, worse and worse. But part of us thinks, like, this is a whole national rebellion thing going on. Like, how could it get worse than that? How could it escalate beyond that? But wait, the pattern of rebellion repeats again. This time with the Levites. Now, why is that significant? It's because the Levites are a particular tribe of Israel that was dedicated towards service at the tabernacle. They were God's like special tribe, set apart. This is the tribe of the priesthood. And this particular tribe instigates a full-on rebellion. They take 250 leaders and attempt a coup. It's a hostile takeover of the priesthood. They basically try to boot out Moses and Aaron as leaders. And And this is coming from the people. This is coming from the Levites who are supposed to be set apart. And the Levites themselves start to legitimize their rebellion by saying things. This is their argument, in fact. They say things like, hey, we're holy too. We're the Levites. We're a Levite as well. We should be the leaders. We should be the priests. Numbers 16, 2 through 3. And rose up against Moses, with them 250 Israelite men, well-known community leaders who had been appointed members of the council. They came as a group to oppose Moses and Aaron and said to them, you have gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly? So these Levites, right, they grumble and argue that they are just as holy and worthy as Moses or Aaron to serve as the leaders. They want to take over their jobs. Now, a hostile coup is pretty bad. How could it escalate any further? How could it go even further? But it gets worse. We had to ask, right? See, in chapter 20, we see that Moses, the prophet, and Aaron, the high priest, even they begin to grumble. They rebel against God. And it almost seems like at this point, everything is unraveling, right? It literally went this rebellion pattern. It started with the rabble, and now it's made its way all the way to Moses. They're all rebelling. And let's zoom in a bit, because this pattern has been escalating, it's been building, and so let's look at this ultimate moment when Moses, his rebellion scene, and see what happens. Because everything has been building to this. And in Numbers chapter 20, we hear about Moses' rebellion, Moses and Aaron's rebellion. So in verse 2 it says, now there was no water for the community. The people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, if only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It is no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell face down. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, take this staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so they and their livestock can drink. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. And he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. Oh my goodness. Can you believe Moses did that? There's part of us that's like, did what, right? Like, did what? Like, what? This grand example of rebellion. It's been building to this moment. What is this terrible, heinous rebellion that Moses did? In fact, it was so bad that Moses, after this moment, is banished from entering the promised land. Whoa, big deal. Now, some will argue that the big thing that happened was something that Moses said. It was something he said. Must we bring the water out of this rock for you, right? Like Moses is attributing it to him, maybe. And others will argue that the big deal in this passage is what Moses did, his actions, right? He struck the rock twice instead of speaking to the rock. But I want you to recognize that in this short little passage, the text is intentionally vague about Moses' actions. It's sort of like the Cain and Abel story. And we see Cain, he brings this offering to the Lord, and it's intentionally vague what's wrong, what's happening. And part of that is because the real issue has to be with something with his heart. Has to do with his heart. Now, we don't need to actually speculate about what happened, like what Moses did wrong. Was it the hit it twice, or was it like something he said? What was it that Moses did wrong? We don't need to speculate, because in the very next verse, God directly tells Moses what he did wrong. In Numbers 20, verse 12, but the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. So the problem is a trust issue. The problem is a faith issue. It's a belief issue, a heart issue that God brings to the surface. And this whole escalation from bad to worse that's been happening, at this moment, it begins to reveal the heart of all the rebellion stories that have been happening over and over and over. What is this root issue of rebellion that's happening through these 11 chapters? It's a lack of faith in God's faithfulness. It's a lack of belief in God's abilities. It's a lack of trust in God's goodness. Now, Moses somehow has this trust breakdown in this passage. That's literally what God said was his crime, right? But how? What exactly was this trust breakdown? Did Moses stop believing in God? Well, that doesn't make sense. He was talking to him, right? That's not the case. Did Moses did he lose faith in God's ability to bring water from the rock? Well, no, that doesn't make sense. In fact, even the scene, we recognize in Exodus 17, Moses did this exact same thing. This exact same thing in Exodus 17. In that chapter, Moses strikes the rock with his staff and water comes out. So it wasn't a lack of faith that water could come from a rock. He's done it before. Now pause. Take a step back with me. What is this issue with trust that God's highlighting? We have to recognize that the rebellion has been building and growing and growing and growing, right? And at this moment, there's this key moment. We see it in the words that Moses uses. Moses is losing faith in God's ability to redeem these broken people. These people are like rebel scum, right? They're beyond being saved. They're beyond redemption. And that's why Moses' judgment and consequence to what he did is so poignant. It's so poignant. Numbers chapter 20, verse 12 again. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. See, Moses loses faith. He loses trust in God's ability to redeem these broken people. And as a judgment, God basically says, when I do redeem them, you won't be with them as we enter the promised land. Like, when I walk them across the Jordan River, you won't be there to see it. You did not trust me enough to think I could do it, so you won't see when I do it. And the core of these stories, these pattern of stories that happen over these 11 chapters, the core of these rebellion moments, and really the core of the book of Numbers, it comes out as the fact that, man, it's not about the goodness of the people. As you start reading these chapters, they're not very good. It's not about the goodness of the people. It's about the goodness of God. I mean, the people are terrible. They're failure after failure. But their redemption doesn't come from their goodness. It comes from God's goodness. Look at God's incredible patience. Because even from the very first failure, when they're grumbling about meat, Moses kind of has like a bit of a nervous breakdown. He realizes, I can't fix this. These people are way too broken. And God steps in even to help Moses in that moment. So how can the book of Numbers be about the goodness of God? This theme that starts happening chapter after chapter. What about all those judgments? All right? What about the consequences that God brings on people? How are those fair and good, right? And this leads us to the second theme that we see, the second key element that happens in this pattern. There's rebellion, and then there's justice. Now we saw that there was a poignant consequence that came to Moses, that justice. But in every single one of these rebellion stories, God's acts of justice are just as strikingly poignant, almost ironic at times. So for example, as you're reading through these 11 chapters, you'll see the people grumbling about eating meat. And the consequence of their grumbling, the consequence of this rebellion, right, is that God gives them meat to eat for a month. And it makes them sick. The only thing they can eat is meat. It blows their mind, but they wanted meat. He'll give them meat. That's the only thing they'll eat. And you'll see Miriam. She's arguing that I'm Miriam the prophetess, right? I'm a prophetess like Moses is a prophet. And so what's the consequence of her grumbling? Well, God basically gives Miriam a chance to prove it. Prove it. I'll put you on the stage. Here's your opportunity to prove you're just as good as Moses. If you remember, one of the signs that Moses was a true prophet was that he could heal himself of leprosy. So God said, okay, Miriam, here's your shot. I'll give you leprosy. Heal yourself. It's whoa. And then when we see the Israelites' rebellion in the wilderness, right at the border of the promised land, it's so poignant, it's almost ironic. Because we read those words earlier from Numbers 14, verse 1. That night all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. You know what their consequence is? God gives them exactly what they just asked for. They spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness, and they all die in the wilderness. It's literally what they asked for. And when the Levites take and do this coup, they try to take over the priesthood, right? They argue that they're just as holy, just as deserving, just as worthy to be priests as anyone else. And what's their consequence? God literally gives them what they asked for. Okay, be a priest. Enter my temple. Enter my tabernacle. If you are holy and worthy like you're saying, I'll stop preventing you from entering. And those 250 priests, right, they get their wish. But walking into God's presence was like walking onto the surface of the sun. They're obliterated. In each of these examples, the manner of God's justice is stunning. Is stunning. God's justice and wrath in these chapters is to basically say, okay, I'll finally let you have your heart's desire, even if it's not me. Basically, if they complained long enough to God, if they hounded God long enough, then God would stop holding back the poison that they keep asking him for. It reminds me of real life events sometimes we go through. Some of us in this room have tried to help someone before who's struggled with an alcohol addiction. And it's an interesting one because sometimes a doctor will come in and say, if that person has one more sip of alcohol, they won't be able to stop. They'll keep drinking. Their liver's on failure. They're going to die. All it's going to take is one sip and they won't make it. And so all their friends care about them. Their family cares about them, right? And so they launch this intervention. They step in and try to save them from themselves. They lock up all their alcohol. And day after day, that friend vehemently attacks you. You don't love me. You're doing this because you're mad at me. You're doing this, get back at me. You're a terrible person. Why would you ever do this? How dare you do this to me? Day after day, they complain and grumble against you. They say they hate you. They call you evil. They slowly alienate themselves further and further away from you until eventually there finally comes a terrible day of justice and wrath. And it's the day that you stop fighting for them. The day you grant their request and stop guarding the liquor cabinet. The day you let them have their heart's desire. And the manner of God's justice through the book of Numbers is stunning, right? Because basically, if they complain long enough and hard enough, God will finally hand to them that poison that he's been guarding from them. Just a side note. If you want to investigate more this stunning justice of God, simply read through Romans chapter 1. Because the Apostle Paul will explain in detail a few paragraphs about, literally he calls it the wrath of God, right? The wrath of God. And sometimes we've got weird ideas that come to mind when we think of the wrath of God and what it looks like. And so Paul, in the first chapter of Romans, Paul basically explains and gives 3 examples of what the wrath of God looks like. And his 3 examples sound like this. God gave them over to their sinful desires of their heart. God gave them over to their lustful desires. God gave them over to a depraved mind. Romans 1, the wrath of God is that he finally lets you have your heart's desire, even if it's not him. Now let's personalize this pattern we're seeing here a bit. This pattern we're seeing with rebellion and justice and also with redemption, because it can begin to overlay. We begin to see, wow, this pattern really is something I see in the world around me, even in my own life. What was the root issue of all that rebellion through the book? I recognize, lack of faith in God's faithfulness, lack of belief in God's ability, a lack of trust in God's goodness. And in our life, so often, our rebellion, those moments in our life, they're rooted on those same issues. It comes about because we don't trust God that he has our best interest at heart, especially when we can't see all the angles. And so, we try to rebel. We try to take things into our own hands, right? And in that moment, sometimes what happens is, God moves it further away. And so we start fighting God even further. And it's God, how dare you do such a thing to me? Why are you keeping this thing away from me? Don't you care about me? And we battle and battle and battle God until God lets us pry that bottle of poison out of his hands. As you read through the book of Numbers, you start to almost seem to lose hope in humanity as these rebellion moments get bigger and bigger and bigger. But the redemption that happens in each of these instances, it doesn't originate, it doesn't come from their goodness. It comes from God's goodness. I'm going to save a deeper discussion of this final theme, this final element that repeats redemption for next week. We're going to explore it in detail, but I will give you part of it to chew on this week. Because often that word redemption that happens in this pattern that happens over and over, it will stem from God's own identity. That's where the redemption comes from. And sure, a lot of times as you're reading through in these stories, the redemption moment, it often takes the form of Moses giving like some sort of intercessory prayer on someone's behalf. But what is it that Moses is praying? What is it that he's talking with God about? Moses is basically praying, and when he does so, he tells God that it's not about the goodness of the people, it's about your goodness. I'll give you one example of what these prayers look like, and then we'll save a deeper discussion for next week. So here's a sample of these prayers, these redemption moments that happen. Numbers 14:17 says, "Now may the Lord's strength be displayed, just as you have declared. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving sin and rebellion. He does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now." The Lord replied, "I will forgive them as you asked." So we get this snapshot. Like, what is it that Moses is praying? What is it that these restoration, these redemption moments, what takes place? You know, we can be complaining sometimes, rebellious, and hard to love. We can be fighting with God. But these redemption moments in these stories, they happen precisely because God is stronger than us. See, in this prayer of redemption that Moses is making, Moses is basically arguing that God, you are better at being patient than we are at complaining. God, you're better at redeeming than we are at rebelling. God, you're better at loving than we are at being hard to love. You know, it's interesting because Moses' greatest failure, what this whole section of like those failure moments is building up to, his big, like he blew it moment, it happened because he stopped believing that. God is better at redeeming than we are at rebelling. He's better at loving than we are at being hard to love. As you're reading through Numbers this week, start to see how like rebellion is this symptom. Start to see how it's this lack of faith and trust. Start to see how God is like, there's this intimidating moment of justice that happens as he hands to people the thing that they're desiring. But start reading closely and preparing yourself. You might even feel like Moses as you're going through these chapters, like, how could God ever save these people? Because next week we're going to look closer at that redemption moment and how it comes when we look at God with faith and trust about who he is. Man, the book is not about the goodness of the people. You're going to have a hard time finding it. It's about the goodness of God that can overcome really broken people. Let's pray together. God, I know that sometimes in our life, we can mess up. We can rebel. We can be like one of those Israelites in the desert. I pray that we would not make Moses' mistake and overestimate ourselves and our abilities. To think that we're better at rebelling than you are at redeeming. That I'm better at being hard to love than you are at loving. And I know we We have people in our lives that are caught in this cycle. So we just lift them up to you now, even in prayer, just like Moses did. Recognizing that, man, God, your character, your identity, it's not about their goodness, it's about your goodness. It's not about their strength to fix their situation, it's about your strength. Pray that we wouldn't forget that as we travel through Numbers together, and as next week we look closer at how it is you redeem, how it is you restore broken, rebellious people. Be with us in this week ahead and keep our eyes on you, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.